I'm going to make a crazy prediction and go out on a limb and say I think that Vladimir Putin will win the elections in March. I think I'm probably a pretty safe ground there. No, seriously, I mean, these elections in Russia are legitimization rituals. Elections in Russia matter. But they don't matter in the sense that elections matter in democratic countries, where you're seeing the will of the people. They matter because the regime uses them to legitimize itself. And it legitimizes itself to the extent that it puts on a good show. It gets a good turnout, it gets a good numbers, but also it puts on a good show. It tells the people a good story that they can believe in. And this is why I think this election might be different from any election we've seen in the Putin period, because in one sense, this regime has run out of stories to tell its people. Putin's first story was, I will lift Russia up off its knees, I will create a dictatorship of law, I will bring you prosperity and stability after the chaos of the 1990s. And that was a very effective story, right? And that story carried Putin all the way, I'd say, to 2011, 2012, when you had prosperity like you'd never seen before in Russia. And what happens, what sociology teaches us, is that when you have a society becomes more prosperous, they stop caring only about economic issues and they start caring about higher issues. And then we had the Bolotnaya protests, right? This was essentially the new Russian middle class saying, we don't want just economic stability, we want political rights, we want political pluralism. Putin then had to come up with a new story, right? And the news story, of course, we sadly know what the news story was. The news story resulted from the annexation of Crimea, the war in the Donbass, and the news story was, I will revive your empire for you, I'll restore your lost pride. So if the old Putin was saying, you will trade your political rights for prosperity, the news story is you will trade your political rights and your prosperity for empire. And that lasted for a little while, but now that is wearing off. What story is Putin going to tell the Russian people this time? I don't know.
What base, what data you have to support the idea? And also, we don't have a clear answer. Can the Kremlin still campaign with this slogan of the mighty military power, international power? Or really people are fed up of that? Because what we know that people are fed up with Donbass in Russia. It's different with Crimea, but it doesn't mean that somehow the nationalistic and military sentiment won't be brought up again.
Yeah, no, I think this story is pretty much running its course in Russia. I mean, at the time of the annexation of Crimea, I made a metaphor comparing this to, it's as if Putin gave the entire country cocaine. Right? The thing about cocaine, other than it being very bad for you, is that it wears off. And when it wears off, you need a stronger dose to keep the same high. And this Crimea drug was very powerful. I call it the Crimea drug. I actually wrote a blog titled The Crimea Drug. The Crimea drug is wearing off now. And the thing about this is that Crimea has packed such an emotional punch for the Russians that it's hard to top this. I believe that Putin is entering his lame duck period. Now, that doesn't mean he's going anywhere tomorrow, but Putin will turn 65 years old next month. He will, like I said, I'm going to go out on a limb and predict his victory in March. He wins another term, 6 years, and then he's 71. And this will be the end of his second consecutive term, right? Now, Putin's been kind of funny about this. He's been very disrespectful to much of the Russian Constitution, but there's one thing he's been very, very, very serious about obeying, and that's the clause in the Russian Constitution that says you cannot serve more than 2 consecutive terms. He went through all the trouble of the castling move with Dmitry Medvedev last time around because he didn't want to violate the Constitution. For some reason, he doesn't want to violate this clause. So 6 years down the road, Putin's going to have a choice. Does he violate the Constitution? Does he amend the Constitution? Does he ignore the Constitution? Stay on, which would essentially make him mean he's declaring himself president for life. So what happens? Well, there's things being discussed in the Russian press and by Russian analysts about this. If you look at the Minchenko report, Politburo 2.0, which is an annual report that looks at the state of the Russian elite, and it's something that's kind of required reading for people like me, something really jumped out at me in this, and he said that the battle for succession will begin around the time of the next Duma elections, and that they will create a post-presidential position for Putin, something akin to an Orthodox Ayatollah, his words, not mine, But this is telling me they're thinking of how to keep Putin in power but not president. Now, these discussions were going on back in 2011, 2012 as well, and they decided against them. They decided to try a different route. But this tells me that Russia's entering a transition period. It's going to be a long one. 6 years is a long time, right? But everybody's going to smell the end of this regime. And when the Russian elite smells the end of a sitting regime, we have instability.
Another story which we were following is the military exercises in Belarus, and there was a lot of there were a lot of concerns.
Yeah.
Yet our correspondents traveled there. We understand there was a limited access for the foreign journalists and for the NATO observers, but we don't know yet what is in the woods of Belarus, but it didn't look like there was really the military exercise which would, go further to some military campaign from the Belarusian side.
No, I never really thought this made sense, that the Zapad was going to be used as a staging ground for an attack on either Ukraine, the Baltic states, or Poland. I never really thought that was the case. I thought it was a very clever psychological operation from the side of the Kremlin to make us think this. But it just never made sense to me. Why would Russia attack Ukraine from Belarus when they already have a militarized Crimea and Donbass from which they can attack? It just didn't make any sense to me. I would echo the words of my good friend Michael Kaufman, the Washington-based military analyst at the Kennan Institute, who said we should not fear Zapad, we should learn from it. Well, now Zapad's over, and what did we learn from Zapad? And for me, I'm less a military analyst, more a political analyst. To me, the most interesting thing about Zapad was what it revealed about the Russian-Belarusian relationship. Because if you look at the run-up to Zapad, Belarus was bending over backwards to reassure its neighbors, Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states, that its territory would never be used to stage an attack by a third party. I think this is very significant because while Russia was trying to do a psychological operation, they wanted us to believe they were going to use this to attack Ukraine because this is what they feed on, this fear. Belarus was doing everything it could to reassure everybody that this wasn't going to be the case, and this is very telling. Why was that the case? Russia did not want to invite NATO observers in at all. Belarus, to the extent that it could, made sure that the exercises were as transparent as they reasonably could be expected to make joint exercises with Russia transparent. They were inviting in NATO observers. They were briefing Western officials about this. So there's this stark contrast in the way Minsk and Moscow approach this, and to me this is emblematic of the Belarusian-Russian relationship. Belarus isn't interested in this conflict with the West, and which this tells me the limits of Russia's imperial model in the former Soviet space. Because people say Russia wants to turn Ukraine into Belarus. Well, guess what, Natalia? Belarus already is Belarus, and they're not that obedient. In fact, they're a big pain for the Kremlin right now. So this relationship is very telling. Putin looks at it as an imperial relationship, but Lukashenko looks at it as a transactional relationship. The way I characterize it is it's like the emperor meets the gamer, right? And it's a very complicated relationship for Moscow to manage. And if this is the best they can do in terms of their new empire in the former Soviet space, that empire doesn't have much of a future. That's what I'd say.
Brian, another thing you are following, it's all these information campaigns which are run by the Kremlin and in generally present in modern politics, international politics. Of course, we can have that after a couple of years, the general public had got a lot more awareness, yet not enough. Though the expert community, really I think a lot of issues had been discussed to the extent that the people like us are a bit even tired of speaking about the same things. Bots, trolls, fake news, how long you can speak about that, though they are still existing. Have you mentioned something new? Are there any new trends?
First, it's a mistake to look at the information campaign in isolation. I think that Russia is waging what I call a non-kinetic war against the West. It's a war. We're not shooting each other. It's non-kinetic, but it's a war. And information is one of the weapons in that war. Corruption is one of the weapons in that war. Russia uses corruption. They weaponize corruption in order to create networks of influence. This is something you have to be very familiar with in Ukraine, but they're doing it elsewhere as well in the West. They've weaponized finance. I mean, look at all the black cash moving around the city of London, for example. I mean, I'm fond of saying corruption's the new communism, You know, the Kremlin's black cash is the new red menace. And so this is something we have to, and this goes hand in hand with the information. You create networks of influence, you put out disinformation. There's many ways to influence a society. They've weaponized cyber as well. They've weaponized organized crime. The second point I would make is that we really need, and we in the West, need to pay very close attention to what Russia does to its neighbors. Because what Russia does to its neighbors today is something they're going to be doing to us tomorrow. Ukraine, Estonia, you were getting hacked long before it was cool, long before we were talking about it, long before it was fashionable. You know, if we were paying attention to that then, we might have been a little bit more ready for the hacking that's happened to the United States, Germany, France, and other countries now. Right? So Ukraine had Russia meddling in its elections long before we understood what this was, right? So you knew what fake news was long before it was a phrase every American and German and French person is talking about. So I say we really need to pay close attention to what Russia does to Ukraine, what Russia does in the Baltic states, what Russia does with Georgia, because it's going to come at us later. And in this sense, we're all Ukrainians, you know, in this sense, because we're dealing with the same thing you've been dealing with now.